Uh, so I think we should start now. Okay. Shall we start, Lukas?
Sure.
Okay.
Let's go.
Okay. First of all, thank you. On behalf of School of Humanities and Social Sciences of Raffles University, I welcome everyone. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lukas. He is a professor of sociology and communication studies at Benji State University, right? USA. His area of interest includes sociology of environment, sociology of methodology, sociology of religion and culture, sociological theories. Besides this, he has published many books and articles interested in issues related to gender, politics, culture, social movement, race and ethnicity, class inequality, equity, right, so and so forth. Today, he's going to talk a bit about 35 minutes or so minutes about environmental justice. And after that, we all have time for some questions. So if you have questions, please write them down and we may select to ask him. Welcome, Dr. Lukas, and we look forward to hear a talk. And before the talk of Dr. Lukas, let me give a brief context of his talk. When I think about environmental justice, it seems the ecological consciousness is often a sign of affluence rather than necessity. I cannot delve into all interrelated aspects in a short webinar, so I will limit myself to some selected comments on environmental justice, followed by a brief account of making of an environmental jurisprudence globally in general and USA in particular. If you see the trend of human civilization, with the advent of Anthropocene and globalization, they brought negativity in the arena of environmental justice. Greenhouse gas concentration reached a new high in 2020. Pollution is now a serious problem for less developed countries as well, like Bangladesh, like India. Largely the city dwellers, right, in that context. The kind of development we have, we can see the marginalized has become more marginalized, right? So in that context, if you visualize environmental justice, then global environmental risk comes into the picture. Global environmental risk caused by human activity are becoming increasingly a complex and interconnected, contested concept with far-reaching consequence from people, economics, culture, and ecosystem. The uneven development has created the conflict between development and environment on the one hand, and the conflict between a developing nation and developed nation on the other hand. In that context, we have to rethink our approach to the climate crisis and environmental justice. If we, because most of you are from India, so if you see the context of India, then we have Forest Conservation Act of 1980, Forest Right Act 2006. Besides these rights, public interest litigation played a very significant role for the actualization of environmental justice in India, we all know. But we can see the pressure of new liberalism. We can see the pressure of crony capitalism on governmental development policy and program. Supreme Court of India amplified that right to life includes right to food, clothing, and a clean environment. We have a decision. There is a case in between Kshatriya Pradushan Mukt Samiti versus state of Uttar Pradesh 1990. But we can see how right to life is ignored by the government. Just see the scenario of Delhi. Delhi has become the most polluted city. We are facing environmental crisis and health crisis at the same time. Robert Boulard, the father of environmental justice, as a sociologist in 1970, he shone a light on how minority disadvantaged communities in Houston, Texas suffered most from the pollution. In that context, he visualized the idea of environmental justice, which seeks to access the fairness of distribution of environmental risks and benefits if we incorporate John Rawls' idea of social justice. We have seen even Greta Thunberg's movement. At the same time, we can see Trump government, formally withdrawn from Paris Convention. Noam Chomsky gave a very harsh criticism by saying the worst criminal in human history is Donald Trump. This statement can be, examined in the context of withdrawing Paris Convention. This is one of the reasons of necessity of voting for mainstream Democrats against Republicans. If you see the trend of elections, emergence of non-violence environmental movement we can see in India for the actualization of the idea of justice, driven from the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi, for example, was in a favor of talking a moralist position when he says the earth has enough to satisfy the human needs, but next to nothing to satisfy the greed of even one individual. We have Nobel laureate Amartya Sen's idea of development as a freedom, which incorporates the political participation of marginalized. That is one of the important content of environmental justice. I can remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. noted in a letter written in 1963 from Birmingham jail, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. After that, we can see USA has a legacy of visionaries such as a president like John F. Kennedy, Roosevelt, who recognized that the environment had a direct connection to democratic ideals. Environmental justice is very multifaceted concept. It is supported by decent paying, safe jobs, quality schools and recreation, decent housing and adequate health care, public participation of democratic decision-making power, communities free from violence, drug alcoholism, so on and so forth. So a struggle for environmental justice are embedded in later struggle against oppression and dehumanization that exists in the larger society, stated by Polido. Peana, for example, makes the essential argument that environmental justice is centrally about autonomy. In that context, we can understand the idea of sustainability, the idea of self-sufficiency. If we, because while I was preparing my talk, I was reading some of the important articles on how a Trump administration, approached environmental justice, and then I found very critical, understanding about environmental justice in the context of US. Trump massive deregulation program and rejection of international environmental solidarity is tragic and puzzles all of us who valued an anti-pollution ethos. Environmental justice has received many other blows than Trump, like the pollution in the ocean, the leakage from pipelines, the poor air quality that causes respiratory failure and increasing rates of asthma in USA, and the general problems of emissions from fossil fuels are all deep concerns that have been eclipsed by corporate maleficence in the production of green energy source. The Republican Party has never recognized globally a concept of global warming or climate crisis. Even Trump says this is a hoax, right? They never recognized climate crisis or the effect of excess CO2 and ozone. Instead, they have shot and achieved rollbacks on the Clean Air Act called CAA and Clean Water Act from the early 70s in 2019. The effect of air and water pollution plus the expanding development, building and roads in natural habitat has caused a gigantic die-off of millions of species. This is also one of the important concerns of environmental justice. If you see Michel Moret, the environmental movements, who stated the environmental movements have reached by addressing local issues like protesting, fracking, and new pipelines apparently ineffective. So far, the result is higher death rate, decreasing longevity, increasing birth defects, decreasing fertility. Many people, if you see, many people see, even in USA, overcrowding, the massive impact of oil and chemicals, and cannot even, think about what life on Earth will be like in future. These predictions can be found in Gary Feuer work of The Invisible Killer. I found very interesting insights when I was reading him. Tim Smedley, cleaning the air. Beth Gardiner, chokes, and the EPA has been, captured by international corporate oil interest, as has the White House and the GOP. So I would like to invite Professor Lukas to give more insights, particularly with the reference to USA, like how the idea of justice is being actualized by the government or the society in general. So, Dr. Lukas, over to you.
Thank you, Randhir. It's good to be here this morning. I'm going to talk a bit about some of my work on theorizing environmental justice through the lens of risk and sociology of risk. Ultimately, I'd like to talk about how to build sturdier democracy, not only local but global democracy, surrounding hazards related to the environment. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and jump in. Environmental justice, basically, I think of it as being defined negatively, in the sense that when we define environmental justice, we define it as an ideal or a principle, and we define it in opposition to the environmental injustices that we find throughout the world and in our local communities, and our collective responses to them. Ultimately, something that I've always liked about environmental justice as an approach versus some of the other approaches to environmental economics, even environmental sociology, is that environmental justice tends to focus on both the local concerns, real-world concerns of people living in a community, and that it's practical or pragmatic. that communities face specific sets of hazards related to the environment and specific sets of public health hazards, which I think Randhir touched on very well in his introduction. I appreciate that. Humanistic approaches often are found in environmental justice, in the sense that there is a focus on how injustice results from human activity and how those injustices are related specifically to human activity, and how human beings can take responsibility for those results and for the uneven consequences in terms of the environment, in terms of public health, in terms of safety, in terms of education, in terms of job creation, and to think about how human judgment both influences environmental injustices as well as holds the key to addressing them in a more democratic way that brings together both the local and the global. So I have some big questions that my work has addressed for a long time. My biggest question, and I'll spend the rest of my life thinking about this, the relationship between society and nature. That's something that I've been really interested in for a long time. And yeah, that's my big question, my big research question. I think about how sociology, particularly sociology of risk and theories of deliberative democracy, can make contributions to addressing and to better approaching environmental issues and addressing environmental injustices. So thinking about how we, and by we here, I'm talking about the United States, how we got here, where we do have a sitting president who seems actively hostile to any kind of environmental initiative. So I'm going to build my talk around thinking about how and why this has happened, what this tells us about global responses to hazards in general and environmental hazards specifically, as well as how to think about things a little bit differently, perhaps a lot differently. So I remember in the final US presidential debate, and I know we're still tallying votes and it's a really close race, the moderator asked a question of the sitting president, President Trump. Some people of color are much more likely to live near oil refineries and chemical plants in Texas. There are families who worry the plants near them are making them sick. Your administration has rolled back regulations on these kinds of facilities. Why should these families give you another 4 years in office? And I will say, I grew up in Texas. I grew up in this environment. I grew up in a working class neighborhood in Texas. So I have seen this up close, and the environmental and public health damages that have been done by the oil industry in the United States and in Texas specifically. The response of the sitting president was that the people in these communities are making more money than they've ever made, and then that his administration had saved the oil industry. So no mention of, or even understanding of, environmental justice, or the fact that people are enduring disproportionate impacts in terms of environmental bads or environmental hazards produced by the production and consumption of fossil fuels. On the other hand, the challenger, Joe Biden, talked about his personal experience in Delaware, growing up near oil refineries, seeing oil slicks on the windows of the cars when they got out to their car in the morning, seeing the pollution, being able to feel tangibly what it was like to be in a polluted environment, seeing the rates of cancer go up, more and more people being diagnosed with cancer, more and more people dying of cancer, in direct relation to these hazards posed by industry. And he said, ultimately, the fact is those frontline communities, it doesn't matter how you pay them, it matters how you keep them safe. So he's offering a very different perspective, and he's addressing seriously environmental justice. The reason I think this is so interesting, not only because this is a close election that's captured a lot of attention throughout the world. But this is also the first time that a presidential debate has explicitly featured environmental justice in the United States here in the year 2020. This really surprises me, knowing that environmental justice work has gone back 50 years, half a century, and finally it makes its way to this platform. So I live in the only country in the world that has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement on climate change. Why has this happened? How has this happened? Frankly, I think it's shameful, but I'm surprised in a broader sense about the United States, a place where environmentalism was cultivated for decades. Before this turn toward the neoliberal paradigm, before this turn in the 1980s toward not only avoiding questions of environmental issues, but being actively hostile toward interventions that had any kind of environmental context. So when I think about how this happened and why this happened, I end up thinking about sociology of risk, particularly thinking about the work of Ulrich Beck, a German social theorist, and some of his early work in the 1990s surrounding life in risk society, life in a risk society. At the end of his foundational work, Risk Society Toward a New Modernity, he offers three possible frameworks for addressing global hazards. And I want to talk about those three frameworks and how those three frameworks help to make sense of where the United States is, these two very different responses to questions of environmental justice and questions of environmental injustice, as well as some transformative possibilities that arise out of this. So their first vision might call back to industry. So writing in the 1990s, almost 30 years ago now, Beck basically takes for granted or thinks the most likely approach to global environmental hazards, to global hazards in general, is going to be a business as usual approach, where we know that risks are coming, we know that climate change is a problem, but we will end up adapting to those risks or minimizing those risks after the fact. In many ways, I think the GOP's response to environmental issues in the United States and Trump's response in this debate specifically strongly suggests a commitment to this approach, a dogmatic commitment to this approach, that questions about inequitable sharing of environmental bads, environmental hazards by people of color, something that the literature has documented extensively in the United States, and something that we see internationally, that populations that are most vulnerable tend to bear the brunt of environmental hazards more often. That the response is economic growth and prosperity. The response that as long as the economy keeps growing, everybody gets better off. And this is an idea we can trace all the way back to Adam Smith in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations. As long as everybody's better off in the long run, we can solve these additional problems as we move along. Because people are wealthier than they used to be, because this is due to the growth of industry, and of course he implies because this is due to deregulation, this assumption that environmental concerns or addressing environmental concerns will kill jobs, will keep people from working, will keep people out of work, will reduce economic growth and bring unnecessary human misery. And also that environmental concerns offer the state a chance to concentrate power over its citizens. That these are fundamental ideas that we get from the Republican Party platform in the United States that you can find in other conservative parties in other parts of the world as well, but I think they really are pronounced in the United States. This idea that a narrowly market-based approach takes for granted that there will be winners and losers, takes for granted that some parts of the population will do really well some parts of the population will suffer, and that's just the way it is, that this is taken for granted to be not only acceptable, but necessary and inevitable. That as long as everybody is better off on average, as long as everybody gets wealthier on average, uh, we can take for granted that vulnerable populations will bear the brunt of economic, public health, and environmental hazards that are produced by the very economic system that's supposed to be enriching them. The problem with this, of course, and you can probably hear that I have a rather critical view of this approach in general, but the bigger problem with this is that if we take for granted, as these global hazards become more pronounced, that there are going to be winners and losers, and that's just the way it is, this has a tendency to fragment democracy. This has a tendency to undermine democratic norms. It has a tendency to turn populations against one another, which is something we're seeing in a pretty profound way in the United States. We're very divided right now. And we're very divided around a lot of issues. I mean, I could talk about COVID-19. I could talk about how I, as a middle-class academic, can stay home and be protected, and my friends and family who are service workers or blue-collar workers have to go out and risk their lives to earn a paycheck. That approach to hazard creates resentment. It creates polarization. It turns us against one another in a way that makes democracy very difficult to maintain. And it creates space for political authoritarianism. It creates space for a strongman leader to step up and say, vote for me, I'll protect you and punish your enemies. And your enemies in this case become, in some ways, your own countrymen and countrywomen. And I worry that as we continue to push for this back to industry paradigm, that we're going to see more rather than less of this in the future, regardless of who wins the presidential election right now. So a second vision, and this is a second vision that has been adopted in many parts of the world. To be simplistic about it, in the United States, those of us who study environmental issues, we look at the EU, we look at the Eurozone, and we say, this is what they're doing. They have adopted a welfare state model to address environmental injustices as well as other types of socioeconomic injustices, that through regulation, through law, through expanding state bureaucracy and making the state more accountable for the long-term welfare and well-being of its citizens, that these hazards can be rolled into this bigger picture, that we can address environmental justice the way that we address poverty, the way that we address lack of health care, the way that we address some of these other big socioeconomic issues when it comes to the relationship between the population and the state. The question, of course, always becomes what to regulate. How do we know? Why should we do this instead of that? And the solution from this welfare state model ultimately becomes scientific knowledge. What we need is more scientific knowledge. And what we need is more scientific knowledge that empowers the state to engineer in a piecemeal fashion a society in which people can live together more equitably. It's ultimately, I think, in terms of what Karl Popper called piecemeal social engineering, taking small changes and making those small changes accumulate over time to solve bigger problems. So it's likely that this approach is more stable, and it's certainly in some ways more equitable than the back to industry vision that the United States has tended to adopt. But there are still some serious problems with this issue. And some of these serious problems are addressed by its critics, by people in the United States who want to go back to Vision 1, who see back to industry as the only way forward. There is a fear that expert management, increased expert management of populations and of populations' needs, creates a space where possibilities have been narrowed to 2 options or 3 options before any kind of public discussion or debate happens, before any kind of community involvement occurs, where you get a referendum that you go for a vote, and that we as citizens are responsible only for signing off on the end goal of that, yes or no, this or that. This, of course, is to be preferable to the first option, but there is a tendency to create what Max Weber famously called rationalization of society. The idea that we create bigger and bigger armies of technocratic civil servants, and that they are making these expert decisions above the heads and often without the knowledge of the population itself. So some of the dangers that the supporters of Vision 1 would point to are real possibilities. The possibility of scientific authoritarianism, the possibility of state authoritarianism, the possibility that addressing global hazards through the welfare state model can and does lead to a concentration of state power and potentially dampens civic engagement and voter participation, and in many ways can be corrosive to democracy as well. So Beck offers us a third vision, and I think this third vision often gets confused with the second vision, reflexive modernization. The idea that we, moving forward, can draw upon specifically the self-reflective and self-critical tendencies of science and of scientific knowledge, not only in the halls of power, not only in terms of state bureaucracy, but as a citizenry more broadly, within and outside institutions, within groups, within communities, to think about being more reflexive, being more self-reflective, in the sense that science tells us to or shows us to in broader areas or arenas of our lives. Reflexive modernization theory, as it's often called, ends up taking us, the way that it's been framed, away from direct environmental justice issues. So in many ways, reflexive modernization theory has been watered down. It's been used or maybe even co-opted by approaches that look more like Vision 2. We need to make our institutions greener. We need to make our businesses greener. I think Beck wanted to do something a lot more transformative than that initially. I think that this vision has a more radical set of possibilities that often get overlooked when reflexive modernization theory is discussed. And I think that in order to really flesh out those ideas, I would bring up the work of John Dewey, at least in the context of the United States, that in order to be self-reflective, one needs to live in a society in which one can interact self-reflectively with other self-reflective human beings. In order to create such a society, you would have to have a specific educational regime in which people were self-aware, were aware of the problems that surrounded them, could constitute themselves as a public in order to democratically address those problems. A politics that doesn't live in a political party or in the halls of power. Not that political parties would go away, but that this wasn't the only space where politics could take place, which of course is another concern that occurs to me in the context of the United States right now, that I watch my fellow citizens argue about whether the Democrats or the Republicans are going to win, and are terrified of one another and are terrified of who is actually going to be the president. But this is not a democratic mode of thought. The idea that one person is going to save us or condemn us based on the election results. This is moving away from democracy. To me, in many ways, this shows us how far from democracy we have already moved. And when I think about environmental issues and environmental injustices in the broader context in which they take place, not only locally or nationally, but globally, the possibility that education inheres, the possibility that education offers in terms of moving away from just training people for jobs or training people to be civil servants, but training people to be self-transformative, to be able to interact with one another as a public, to be able to think about themselves, not just in terms of formalized university education, but as people who are addressing real experiences that they themselves have had, are able to address experiences that others have had, are able to take the perspective of the other in a more fully fleshed out way. And in many ways, I see Joe Biden as a sort of centrist, pragmatic career politician in the United States. But I think that the way that he spoke to environmental justice resonates in this sense, because he doesn't speak as a presidential candidate so much as he speaks as a stakeholder. He speaks as a person who has experienced environmental injustice. He speaks as a person who grew up in an environment with oil-slicked windows. He talks about increasing cancer rates. He talks about the real felt consequences of environmental injustice from the perspective of someone who's actually experienced them. And I think that that's a really important and a really telling sign in terms of giving me some hope, among other things. But in this way, if we can talk about being stakeholders and think about being stakeholders as involved in decentralized movements around environmental issues, organizing around environmental issues, participating as communities around injustices that affect us as individuals in a real and tangible way, this creates the potential to share more equitably in environmental bads or hazards. I think of injustice as being the inequitable sharing of bads when it comes to environmental justice. My argument isn't that environmental consequences are going to go away. Of course, that's untenable. We're not going to wake up in a clean and pristine world again. The Anthropocene is upon us, and we have to adapt to varying degrees. But if we can at least share more equitably in some of the consequences, not only locally, but globally. And I speak as a citizen in the #1 greenhouse gas emitting country in the world. So when I say this, I acknowledge and do not take lightly that I speak from the position of someone who has benefited inequitably from the production of greenhouse gas emissions, and also potentially as someone who will not be affected as much by the long-term consequences of climate change. So I have to be self-reflective. I guess self-reflexivity starts at home in that sense. And I have to acknowledge that as a human being who lives in this world and who experiences and also perpetuates environmental injustices, that I have a responsibility to be more self-reflective, and that I have a responsibility to use my capacities as a social being to aid in the process of building this global reflexive democracy that is going to be necessary to achieving a more equitable world in terms of environmental issues. So the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords are a non-binding agreement. Circling back to them, and this is where I want to finish up for today so that we have some time for questions. The Paris Accords are non-binding. They're not going to force anybody to do anything. They're not going to require anybody to do anything, but they're the first step in building this kind of global democracy. The very idea that they are non-binding creates a space where we can bridge the local and the global, where we can, as a global civilization, think about how to respond to global hazards more proactively, where the very non-binding nature of them creates a space where we could have what Nancy Fraser would call a virtuous circle. Democracy can beget more democracy through deliberation, through participation, through taking for granted ultimately. And this is something I take to heart as well, the fallibility of human beings. And I think that a lot of deliberative theory does not capture this as well as some of the discussions around environmental injustice. I'm thinking about the limits of our own horizons and experiences, and how this creates a space where we have to participate deliberatively with one another in order to even address what the problem is, let alone solve it. So I
So
don't know. I don't know
thank
that
you. No, thank you so much. You are, speaking something which is very fundamental in the sense, right? Because environmental matters hardly get center stage unless they reach to a catastrophe stage, right? So we don't have, I would say, the environmental sensitization, right? And the kind of development we have, very negative in the sense, because we don't value democracy, right? The kind of democracy we have, right? And the kind of environmental movement, right? We can see the detach from environmental concern when we understand the political or democratic role of our representative. In that sense, I can recall the work of McCarthy, right, who states that the most important part of environmental justice activism is building capacity, right? A community capacity, facilitating a community empowerment. And here democracy comes into the picture. Here political representative comes into the picture, right? So you well articulated the idea of social environmental injustices, environmental justices, and in a very simple manner. So now I would like to invite students to question. If you have any queries, you can ask. Can you read? There is Bharat Singh is asking. Thank you so much. I have a question in my mind. Are we witnessing a new catastrophe and a risky cosmopolitan movement in the crucial time of coronavirus? Oh,
Short answer, yes. I wrote a magazine article that just got published that dealt with risk society and thinking about COVID-19 through the lens of risk society. I very definitely see COVID-19 as being amenable to these three potential approaches, and I see the United States adopting Vision 1, and I see that as one of the reasons why it has taken a pretty consistently heavy toll in the United States, because the priority was to get people back to work and to keep the economy growing. And some of the more welfare state models that adopted stay-at-home orders and curfews and some of these other things, they did a little better. They fared a little better in the short term. But there's still a sense that there's resentment in the population, that people are upset about losing their jobs, that the economy contracted significantly. I think about some of the most basic aspects of addressing COVID-19. Wearing a mask, wearing a cloth mask is so symbolic in the sense that it doesn't protect me from getting it. The purpose of the cloth mask is to protect the people around me from getting it if I happen to have it. And I think that's so symbolic of what this sort of looks like, to think about how our interactions have these effects on others, and how to build community around the fact that my actions have consequences for others that I have to be aware of at the front end, and that are shaped by my own self-reflectivity as a member of this society.
Oh, thank you so much. Actually, you just mentioned the work of Karl Popper, right? I am also, article named "Science Denial and Falsification: Popper and Causality," where I, pointed out like how postmodernism emerged as a mixing of science and rhetoric, because decision in politics were mixture in of science and authority, right? And then I differentiated between the affairs of science and the affairs of authority, right? I recognized one important work of called Louis Anthony Cox Jr. He is an advisor of President Trump, and he is also the chair of CASAC, that is Clean Air Science Advisory Committee. And Cox is a professor of at the University of Colorado, and he had published several texts on risk analysis, and he found that the draft ISA, that is Integrated Science Assessment for participate matters, does not provide a sufficient comprehensive systematic assessment, and the effect of his decision is to dismantle the CAA, that is the Clean Air Act. So I was finding some of the interesting point about as far as the risk society or its conceptualization is concerned. So thank you so much, sir. I'm going to send that article I have just drafted. I will send you tonight. And meanwhile, you spoke so well, and particularly you incorporated the idea of democracy in explaining environmental justice, the idea of social justice, the environmental